Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more.
Hello and welcome back to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, government, politics, business, education, whatever gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder of Compass. I am not joined this week by Compass editor Scott Barker, who is on assignment. He is covering the city of Knoxville's annual budget retreat today, so I'm sure he's having a lot of fun there, and you can read about whatever he learns there in Compass next week. Compass is a local subscription-based independent news organization. You can find us at CompassKnox.com. And I am joined here in the palatial studios of Barbarian Productions by our producer, Seth Barber. How are you doing, Seth?
Doing good. I was thinking about I was gonna be Scott and say something about Alabama football and some other self-defacing joke that he likes to make about himself, and then tell you the weather. But I couldn't think of anything in time. So
give us the 3-day-old weather report.
It was shorts week. We got the shorts back out.
Yeah,
the kids like to wear shorts even if it's 12 degrees. But it was like, hey, I turned the AC on in the car one time this week. It was exciting. The shift is changing, but then of course in proper East Tennessee style, we get slapped back with a couple of freezing temperatures the last couple of nights.
There was frost on my windshield.
It was chilly this morning for sure. So we'll see how it goes. And it's East Tennessee weather. It's what we do.
It's supposed to get a lot of rain on Sunday, I think, the day that this episode is released. And so maybe that's something you can do is get yourself a nice warm cup of coffee or tea or hot cocoa and sit inside, listen to the rain, and get caught up on Knoxville news and events with our podcast. We do have some things to talk about this week. We have a good interview coming up in a little bit with Steve Smith, who's the executive director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. There was big news both on the local and national fronts this week having to do with environmental and climate policy. The Tennessee Valley Authority is going to not close 2 coal-fired power plants that it had originally said it was going to close. We will talk about that and also the impacts of the Trump administration's reversal of a policy that said the Environmental Protection Agency has the jurisdiction to regulate carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. Also, we'll talk about a proposal by State Representative Sam McKenzie, Democrat from Knoxville, looking for some transparency on the state's voucher program. The Juvenile Service Center, Knox County Juvenile Service Center, which we've talked about a lot here, had some good news this week for once. It's been a while since there was identifiable good news coming out of that facility. We'll hit on that. I'll talk a little bit about the school system having to contend with growth and balancing student populations in the Powell area. But to start out, we had a report on Friday written by my colleague, Scott Barker, which you can find on our website, about the community response program to emergency services calls, also known as alternative response. This was something that you may remember because we've certainly talked about it here on the podcast. It's been in Compass, although it's been a little while. This was an issue that there were a big group of advocates spent a year or more sort of talking and lobbying with City Council and with the Concannon administration to create an alternative responder program. And this is something that's been adopted in actually many cities across the country. They've become increasingly common in just the last 5 years. There's nearly 90 of these programs in different places. And what these are is it's basically looking to create a response team for certain kinds of emergency calls. So if they get a call for somebody who's, you know, maybe having a mental health challenge or Is somebody has just called in and said there's somebody down the street who seems like they're in some kind of distress, but there's no indication that, they're violent or dangerous or anything like that. The idea is that the alternative response team or the community response team, which would be made up of 2 people with backgrounds and training in, social services and de-escalation, and also people who are familiar with the resources that are available, social services that are available, they can respond rather than sending an armed police officer to respond. And the advocates for this say that it can accomplish multiple things. For one thing, it can take a burden off the police department of having to respond to some of these calls, which are not really, law enforcement calls, but they're calls that go to 911 and get funneled to the police department just for lack of anybody else to respond to them. So there's that benefit. And then the other benefit that people argue for is that by, removing the law enforcement presence, which it carries with it, obviously, the threat of arrest and detention, as well as possible use of force, it kind of inherently de-escalates a situation because the people who are showing up are not going to be armed. They're not going to be perceived as threatening. And they're just going to show up and, try to talk to whoever the person or people involved in the event are and try to get them help in various ways, which could take various forms depending on what they need. So the Knoxville Police Department already has a co-response program that they've been running for several years now, which has had some success. And in that program, there is an officer that's part of the team, but then there's also a social services worker who goes with them, and they respond to people with mental health crises. A lot of times they're responding to people who are experiencing homelessness. That has had, I think generally good reviews from both the police department and the social service agencies. And so what City Council did a year ago or so was form a task force to study this alternative response model and see if they wanted to take the next step past the co-responder program, and go all the way to having a response option that doesn't have any police engagement at all. And that task force issued a report last week, a long and detailed report. It's over 100 pages long, and you can find that on the city's website. It's also linked in our story. And it basically kind of looked at how these programs have worked in other places and looked at Knoxville's needs and recommended that the city go ahead. Well, this is actually a joint city-county task force. So its recommendations are to both the city and county government, but it will be up to city council, county commission, the city and county mayors to decide whether or how they actually want to proceed with this. But the recommendation in the report is to create a pilot program, maybe with, an initial set of these community response teams who would be trained in de-escalation. They'd receive a lot of training in, dealing with people who are having mental health episodes and that kind of thing. They would not be sent to any calls, or at least under the recommendation, they would not be sent to any calls that involve anybody with criminal history. If anybody calls in and says that somebody has a gun or other weapon, if the situation as reported to 911 seems threatening or chaotic in any way, those aren't the calls they would be going to. They would mostly be going to calls having to do with, homeless people who somebody, maybe observes and says, hey, there's a guy down the street who seems to be, having some issues, or even it's really cold outside and I see somebody asleep on the sidewalk and I'm worried about them. Can somebody check on them? That kind of thing. And also calls where somebody reports a quote unquote suspicious person. And a lot of times these are calls where somebody looks out their window and they see somebody who they don't recognize walking down the alley and they have concerns about them. So these kinds of calls that don't present obvious indicators of any danger to anybody, but somebody needs to go and kind of check on somebody. So that's the recommendation. Of course, everything costs money. The report estimates that to start up a program like this, there would be an initial investment of $450,000, and the first year of operations would be $800,000 to $1 million. That's a relatively small percentage. It would be a small percentage of either the city or county budget, certainly dwarfed by the budgets of the police department and the sheriff's office. But obviously, it's not nothing. So they would have to come up with money from somewhere. So the initial response from the Kincannon administration was kind of non-committal, just like, well, we need time to actually read this and think about what this would look like and if this is something we want to pursue. So there is obviously more to come on this, and if either the city or the county does proceed with a pilot program, I'm sure there will be a lot of talk about the details of that, what exactly it entails and exactly what kinds of calls they're going to make. Also, who's going to manage this, because it's not a law enforcement function. So, does it still fall under the law enforcement agencies or under, community services in either the city or county? There's a lot of logistical and administrative things to be resolved there. But if you've been wondering whatever happened to the alternative response model, that task force has in fact been meeting and been busy, and they produced this report. Seth, do you have any thoughts about it?
I maybe, I don't know. I haven't put a lot of thought into it. It's a, there's parts of it that make sense, and there's parts of it that don't. I'd be concerned of who the, where is this something that not Young Williams, pardon me, that's the animal control people, the McNabb Center might be staffing these individuals, and then what's the protocol for, okay, this is a call that we didn't think was going to have a problem, but we're having a serious problem with this call, and how that's going to... Yeah,
and so that was one thing the report looked at. It said that in other cities that have these models, about 2 to 3% of the calls that the teams get sent on do end up being escalated to, they'll maybe get there and suss it out and say, actually, we think this is a law enforcement. Like, we want to have law enforcement here. So in 2 to 3% of those calls, that's happening. But that's a very low percentage. So it means that, 97, 98% of the calls they're getting sent out on, they don't require law enforcement. Of course, that comes back to how well are you screening those calls on the front end. There would need to be training for 911 operators. 911 already does a lot of, as a call comes in, they're very quickly determining which agency needs to respond. Is this the police? Is it the sheriff's office? Is it the fire department? Or in the city now, they have the co-responder model. So that is one thing that 911 operators in the city are already attuned to. So there would need to be training there. Everybody would need to be kind of on the same page about which calls they're going to. And, I think the question about who would operate it, that's a very serious one. It would most likely be contracted out to somebody. So that means you would need a contractor who wanted to take it on. The McNabb Center in the past, the McNabb Center is the partner in the co-responder program, which they are comfortable with. In the past, they have expressed some reservations about sending any of their people out without a police officer. So, who knows? They may or may not be interested. It would probably depend on really how it gets fleshed out.
Right. And then the follow-up could kind of front-end concern that comes to mind is what kind of authority will these people have when they show up? Is it going to be, okay, well, this is what needs to happen, but is the person that they're in contact with willing to do the things that are needed to be done? Or is this more of a kind of a community outreach thing? Here are some options available to you, citizen, that we can help you get started with or whatever. But if you want to do it or don't want to do it or whatever, because that gets into the mental health one that gets, if mental health specific calls are a lot of these, the target for these, which totally makes sense in not bringing an officer in, because you bring the uniform, you bring the gun, things get more tense than they already were for that individual. But then at the same time, it's like, well, where's this individual at on the hurting themselves spectrum or potentially hurting other spectrum? Then do we need to bring law enforcement in to take care of that, or do they have some level of authority on their own? And how that's going to fit into
I think they would not
the
have authority in the sense of being able to coerce anybody, which of course is what a law enforcement officer can do. They have coercive power. So this would be more about assessing, figuring out what are the needs, what are the options, and then I think a lot of that would come in with their training. Like, okay, you get to a call, you assess that, oh, this person could really use this service. How do you get them to accept that?
Right.
And how do you connect them with that? And so I think that's where a lot of that training would come in. And a certain amount of it, maybe just calls where people go out, check on somebody, and it's fine. And that already happens. I mean, already there's plenty of calls that police respond to and they get there, and either the thing has already subsided by the time they get there, or they kind of assess it and say, like, there's not really anything we need to do here. That could certainly be the case with a lot of these calls. And in that case, again, that's saving time for the police department having to do that. So that would be the benefit to KPD, or if it was in the county, to the sheriff's office, in allowing them to focus more on the things that do really require their attention and intervention. So we will see. Obviously, there will certainly be a lot of discussion about it before anything concrete happens, and probably a lot of hypotheticals will get talked about, and a lot of scenarios will get talked through.
Well, I'm on board with any option that keeps police out of knocking on doors when it's not necessary. So I'm curious to see how this all breaks out.
Yeah, me too. All right. Rezoning in Powell. If you live in Powell or you spend any time in Powell, you know that Powell has been growing, or the areas around Powell have been growing. There's lots of new subdivisions going in out there, and it's that kind of northern section of the county has not been quite as rapid in its development as the northwestern area around Hardin Valley and through Carnes, but there is still a lot of growth going on up there. And one thing that happens when you get growth in an area, when people move into an area, they move into existing school zones, and the school zones are set up based on the people who are already there. So when new people come in, it can lead to imbalances, and that is what has happened in Powell. And they have some schools that are they're not overcrowded necessarily, but they're on track to become overcrowded. And there are others that have capacity that they could absorb more. The only school that is actually overcrowded right now is Powell Elementary, which has a capacity of 600 students and currently has 792 enrolled. So what the school system's trying to do is figure out how to bring Powell Elementary back down to a manageable level. And what they're looking at doing is just shifting some students who are currently zoned to Powell to other local elementary schools, specifically Carnes, Bricky McLeod, and Amherst. All of those have some room to accommodate new students. And so this is the plan they've put forth. This plan, unlike some of the other solutions that the school board's pursuing in various areas, including Farragut and the new school that's being built in sort of northwestern Knoxville on the site of former rural high school. The Powell solution does not involve building new capacity. It's just sort of rejiggering who gets sent where. Every time you do this, there's always a certain amount of angst, because you are often relocating people from one school where they already know their friends and their teachers and so forth to another school. And so a lot of times they kind of do a phased approach where people who are already at a certain grade level can continue on, and they phase in the new zoning over time. No indications at the moment that there's going to be a lot of drama around this, but almost inevitably there's going to be a neighborhood somewhere where people, it's always the ones right on the edge of the new zone, right. Where it's like your friends down the block or the kids on the next street are still going to your old school, but now you're going to get sent to Carnes or Bricky McLeod or whatever.
Right, on a personal one for me, like it boggles my mind. I'm further away from the high school we're zoned for than another one, like physically further away, but because of the way stuff is spread out, and and it gets weird. Like on a personal note again, is it gets weird how it breaks down because I'm the old school model of you kind of like if you start in elementary school, you should go all the way through high school with your friends, right? Not really, not really with the way Knox County has spread out.
Well, that's actually one thing they are going to address with this proposed rezoning is that the students who stay at Powell Elementary will continue on, at least under the current zoning. Things can always change in the future, but all of those students would continue on then to Powell Middle and to Powell High School. Right now, some of the students at Powell Elementary end up getting sent over to Carnes, and so they're already getting kind of they lose their elementary school friends and get sent somewhere else, and so this does actually give them the opportunity to create that sort of coherent trajectory for people in Powell.
Yeah, I mean I'm a bad example because I moved states in the middle of a couple of times through my schooling career, so it's good for your kids. It's good for your kids to mix up their friend groups. It's a good way to get rid of some bad friends by changing schools.
That's right. I mean, it can be, people often think about this as, you're taking them away from their friends, but it could also be like, you're taking them away from that kid who like steals their lunch money. So, there can be benefits too.
It's a short-term bully instead of a lifelong bully in their lives, and they get that out of the way. Because then, you go to high school with them too, and then you graduate, you go back to a reunion, and you still got to see them 25 years down the road. So maybe that's a more silver lining way to look at this one.
Another thing to mention, as I said, we've talked a lot about the Juvenile Service Center, the Richard L. Bean Juvenile Service Center, although people mostly aren't using the full name these days because, of course, Richard Bean, the longtime superintendent there, was obliged to retire/resign last year under some clouds. And we have talked about how the county is wrangling with that center, who should run it. The current proposal is that it will come under the direction of Juvenile Court Judge Tim Irwin. But in the meantime, as they are dealing with all that, they got some good news this week. By they, I mean specifically the Juvenile Service Center Board of Directors, which is made up of 5 members of Knox County Commission. While they were meeting...
I got to interrupt because this one always... This is a super... dork subset of it is it's 4 county commission members and a public member who also happens to be a member of county commission.
Right. It was set up to be four commissioners and a member appointed by Judge Irwin. And then it shook out that the member Irwin appointed was County Commissioner Rhonda Lee. So it's actually 5 county commissioners. It's essentially a subset of county commission. But while they were meeting this past week, they got a text message from the state, the Department of Children's Services, saying, "Congratulations, your juvenile center is once again meets state licensing requirements," which it has not for the past 3 years. It's been out of compliance on multiple fronts, and some of those were the things that led to Bean's departure. But they have made enough progress and presented that to the state for the state to say, okay, you've still got some things to work on, but you are now, going to be a fully licensed by the state juvenile center. The temporary superintendent who they have there reported to the board that of 96 deficiencies at the center that were identified in a report last year that was presented to the county, 81 of them have been satisfactorily addressed. That leaves 15, and some of those are some of the major items that remain. They have to do with things around security and some of the actual physical structures and things they have in place there. Those haven't been addressed yet because they need money. The county doesn't have. There was not just a pot of money sitting around to spend on new improvements at the Juvenile Service Center. I think we can probably expect some discussion of that in the county's budget this year. But for now, there's still those 15 things. But it doesn't really change anything about the operations. I mean, they were already operating without the state license. They were just operating sort of under, on probation with the state. But they it's not like the state had shut them down. The state had just rescinded their.
Well, because that's one of the issues
licensing.
that got us to where we are, is that it's the state doesn't have a lot of teeth to shut you down if you're out of compliance.
Right. It turns out that revoking your license doesn't actually shut you down.
Right. And so it brings to question what the license actually meant in the first place, I suppose, other than, hey, these are the guidelines that we'd like you to do, please. Pretty please. And I know there's some talk in the state of maybe adjusting that this session.
Yeah, there's been talk about giving more teeth to that. A lot of that talk prompted by the Knox County Center, in addition to some other juvenile centers. This is not the only juvenile center in the state that's had problems in recent years. So, just it's sort of a box check, but obviously a good box check that makes county commission and the members of that board feel good about the trajectory they're on, and they're actually going to be taking another step along that trajectory this month, which we will talk about in a little bit when we talk about meetings coming up this week. The other thing I wanted to mention before we get to the interview with Steve Smith is State Representative Sam McKenzie, who is a Democrat from Knoxville, one of two Democrats in our local delegation. He proposed a bill that was heard in a House subcommittee this past week that would have required a little bit of transparency from the state's voucher program. And of course, we're only in the first year right now of the statewide voucher program that Governor Bill Lee and the Republican supermajority in the legislature created last year, or created 2 years ago. It went into effect last year. It has not had a lot of transparency. The state is very deliberately, we talked about this a bit last week, not collecting a lot of information on, or certainly not making public a lot of information about who actually is using these vouchers. There are 20,000 students across the state using vouchers this year. Lee wants to double that to at least 40,000 next year.
What was the original plan? The original plan was to add 10,000 a year until they hit a number, or
no? I think this is I think he's following the plan that they stated, which was to start with 20. If there seemed to be sufficient demand, which there is, they got more applications than they were able to fulfill. That they would double it in this second year. And then beyond that, there's not a specific target.
Okay.
The goal is to grow it to meet demand to the extent that state funds are available for it. So that's kind of a...
Right. And in the same phase, it was going to drop the income requirement for the first...
Yes. So this current year, the students who are in school right now using vouchers, those 20,000 students, 10,000 of those were awarded to people who were under a certain income level. It was not a very low income level. It was, I think, 300% of free and reduced school lunch levels, which I think for a family of four put it up well over $100,000. So it was around 95% of all the households in the state qualified under that income limit. And then there was the other 10,000 vouchers were given with no income limit at all. So the other 5% of households could qualify for those ones. So then in this coming year, there would be essentially no income limit at all. And those 40,000 would be awarded. The people who got them the first year would get preference for getting them the next year. That's how the program works. But in adding new people, there would not be an income limit for it. I'm not actually sure if they are making an effort to spread them out geographically across the state. I mean, the reality is these have been and are going to continue to be heavily concentrated around our biggest population centers because that's where the most people and the most students are, but it's also where the most private schools are. There are a lot of smaller counties around the state that have very limited, if any, private school options for people to actually go to and use these. So they will still be used mostly in our larger counties. Lee is proposing to double that this year. That would raise the cost up to around $340 $350 million. I'm sure there will be a lot of talk in the legislature about that, but the Republican supermajority, obviously very supportive of this program, or most of them anyway, and so probably they will be in line to increase its budget. But Sam McKenzie, his bill is not trying to change any of that. It was just saying, hey, let's at least know where these kids are coming from, because the program was very much sold on the idea that it'll provide an option for students who are struggling in their current public school. You know, is this idea that students are trapped in public schools, which is not actually
quote,
true.
Quote, failing public schools.
Right. They call them failing public schools because they're the schools that score lowest on state tests and various metrics. That doesn't mean the schools are failing. That is almost entirely correlated just with the income level, the poverty level of the students in the school. But still, you could argue that, well, my kid, has to go to a school that's full of all kids who are struggling in various ways, and they might do better at a school where they're surrounded by a more diverse array of kids. The reality is, in a lot of places, certainly including Knox County, you already have options in the public school system. We have magnet schools, for one thing, that anybody can apply to, but you can also transfer between schools, and students who are in lower performing schools are given priority in making those transfers. So there are already kids who transfer from, who are zoned for, say, Austin East High School, but go to West or go to Farragut or go to some other school. So the whole kind of like kids being trapped in schools talking point has always been a little misleading.
Even if that's if that was the stated case on why we're going to do this kind of thing, you would think that the natural would be, and here's the proof, which is what Sam's kind of proposing. It's like, well, if this is the thing that you guys said you want to do, well, we're going to track it to see where the kids are coming from, so that we know that the people who are using this to get out of their failing schools are taking advantage of it, instead of just everybody and anybody, which, again, rhetorically and reality are not the same thing here. But at least, Sam's argument is that let's keep the rhetorical conversation going and prove it.
Yeah. And the thing that he knows and that everybody knows, because this has been shown in other states. Other states had moved to universal vouchers before Tennessee had, and a lot of those states did track where students were coming from because people asked these exact questions. And what it's shown is that the more open you make it in terms of having income limits, or in terms of, like, there are programs that actually do restrict it to students who are in public school who want to go to private school. If you remove all of those requirements, the most likely thing that you're going to get is people who already have their kids in private school, because there are about 100,000 or so private school students in Tennessee. If you're one of those families and the state comes out and says, we will send you a $7,000 check to help pay tuition at a private school, and you're already paying that tuition, of course you're going to sign up for it. That's what has happened in other states. And
it's worth the effort to hire somebody to do the paperwork for you at that level.
Yeah, and especially, like, let's say you have 3 kids in private schools. That's $21,000 that the state's going to send you. And that is what other states' data have shown. Tennessee, anticipating that, very consciously decided not to collect or report that data because they didn't want, by the time we got to the second or third year of the program, they didn't want it to be completely obvious that this was mostly just a state entitlement handout to affluent families who are already sending their kids to private schools. So Sam McKenzie's bill just requested that the state report that every year, that it report what counties, first of all, like how many kids per county in the state, just so you can kind of see where the usage is. And then where were they in school last? Like the year before they first applied for a voucher, where were they enrolled? Was it a public school? Was it a private school? That was his proposal, and it was shot down in the House K-12 subcommittee, which means it will not advance onto the broader education committee. The only people who voted for it were McKenzie and the other Democrat on that subcommittee, who's Representative Yusuf Hakim of Chattanooga. And, McKenzie put out a statement afterwards, just basically saying he was disappointed and saying that in his view, this kind of shows that the whole program is being kind of misrepresented, because if it really is what you say it is, then why wouldn't you want to report that? There is still another bill that would accomplish a lot of the same things that's being pushed by a Republican, State Representative Jody Barrett, who has been a skeptic of vouchers. He has not supported the program, and he has about 5 or 6 other Republican representatives who have co-sponsored it. That bill might get a little more hearing just because it is coming from a Republican. It's sponsored by a group of Republicans.
This is how state politics works in Tennessee.
Yeah. Now, Mark White, who's the quite powerful chair of the House Education Committee, was pretty non-committal when asked about Barrett's bill. He said he didn't like McKenzie's bill. He didn't think that was, that it did what we needed to do. He didn't really explain that, but he was non-committal about Barrett's bill and said he needed, time to kind of think about it and discuss it. So we'll see. Some of this might depend on how much pressure Republican representatives are feeling from people. This sort of, despite the state's best efforts to not provide fuel for the idea that what they're mostly doing is sending checks to wealthy families, that talking point is still very much out there, and it is not going away, and it probably will only grow in volume as the cost of the program increases. So I guess we'll see. Maybe some of the Republicans on these committees will decide that they need to at least provide. This is public money that we're spending. And, there is the sort of conservative belief that governments should be accountable and transparent with their use of taxpayer funds. So maybe we will get some more clarity to go along with the expansion of the program, or maybe not. We'll see. Okay. Now we're to our interview with Steve Smith of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. As I said up top, I thought he would be a good person to talk to about the events of the week, which have been dramatic, even if not all of them were unexpected. But what does it mean for the Tennessee Valley Authority Board, which is now the Trump appointee-led board, to decide, after many, many years of moving down the path of decommissioning its coal-fired power plants, that no, we're actually going to keep a couple of the biggest ones open? And then also, how does all of this fit into, and what is the impact of the Trump administration's reversal of the EPA's finding that greenhouse gases and carbon emissions are harmful to human health and therefore subject to federal regulation? A lot happened this week, and Steve walks us through all of that. So, Seth, let's go to the tape. All right, and we are joined this week by Steve Smith, Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, to talk about some major and maybe a little bit alarming news that happened this week, both locally and nationally. Steve, thanks a lot for jumping on here. And to start off, maybe can you just quickly tell us about the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy for people who are not familiar?
Great. Thanks, Jess. So the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy is a regional, both energy policy and environmental advocacy organization that does work throughout the Southeast United States. So primary states are Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. We do a lot of interventions and regulatory proceedings at the state level, because in many of these jurisdictions, you have monopoly utilities that are required to have oversight by state regulators. And so we engage in a lot of the regulatory dockets, things like integrated resource planning, rate cases, and other things with large investor-owned utilities. The Southeast has some of the largest energy companies in the world. Think about it like Duke Energy, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Southern Company, NextEra, Florida Power and Light. These are very large entities, and they're typically vertically integrated, whereas they're not in competitive markets like we have in other parts of the country. So the regulatory regime is kind of unique. And then with something like TVA, it's kind of completely a unicorn the way they're structured, because they're federal. And so therefore it requires a lot of adaptability to go in and work. But utilities primarily, and then we do a lot of work in electric transportation and energy efficiency. And the primary goal is to reduce the environmental footprint of how we produce and consume energy in the region.
All right. Well, speaking of that unicorn, TVA, the TVA Board of Directors met this past week for the first time with its full complement of new Trump appointees. They haven't even had a quorum for the last year, and so weren't able to meet and take any action. And the action they took this past week reflected some changed priorities as a result of that changed administration and the new people who are on the board. So the most, I guess, attention grabbing, and we wrote about this at Compass, but the thing that they did that really sent, I think, a pretty clear message about where they're coming from and going to is they reversed a decision to shut down 2 coal-fired power plants. And so I guess my questions for you are, first of all, were you surprised by that, or had that been telegraphed to some degree? And, what does that actually signify to you?
Well, honestly, I'm not surprised by anything TVA's doing these days, because they are so kind of untethered from reality that it is it's problematic. And you may have seen the piece that I did in response to this, where I sort of talk about the Ministry of Truth in the Orwellian sense out of the 1984 novel has dictated through Truth Social and Truth tweets that, this shall be the order of reality and we are all to comply with it. That's kind of the world we're in right now. And so it's not grounded in good empirical science, nor is it grounded in good economics. Just to give your listeners a little bit of context, when the Trump administration was elected, they within a few months of being in, Marsha Blackburn, the senator from Tennessee, began to orchestrate a move to try to mold TVA's decision making into things that she liked and the Trump administration liked. So there was this big push on, nuclear reactors, small modular reactors in Oak Ridge, even though they're not sort of, again, grounded in good economics. And then there was also this desire to pull away from, not that TVA had an aggressive renewable program, but even more so pull away from renewables and try to reinstate some coal plants that were over a multi-year planning process that were set to retire. One being the Cumberland, which is TVA's largest coal-fired power plant outside of Clarksville, Tennessee, and the second being the notorious Kingston plant, which is in East Tennessee near Harriman, just west of Oak Ridge. And these are Kingston in particular predates Elvis's first album, came to power when Dwight Eisenhower was president. It is a 1954 vintage coal plant that is not very efficient. It's large, not as large as Cumberland, but it's large. But it is most notorious for the Kingston coal ash spill, which is the largest industrial accident in the history of the United States on land. You can also, in another fossil fuel issue, you can look at the Deepwater Horizon as being the largest one at sea. But the Southeast, in 2008, we had the Kingston coal ash spill. In 2010, we had the Deepwater Horizon. That shows you we've been heavily impacted by, fossil fuels. No one was killed that night in December in 2008, but 50 plus people have died in the cleanup, and it's been very devastating to the community. And it was a phenomenal amount of coal ash, toxic coal ash, spilled out on that late December evening. The reason I emphasize that is, you ask, how did this sort of come into being? It was that event that opened the door for us for the first time for TVA to really start having a serious conversation about retiring these old coal assets. And so I was invited to testify before the Environment and Public Works Committee shortly after that happened in early January 2009. And we got TVA to re-engage the integrated resource planning process. We got them to begin, which is their long-range planning, to start talking about, if you deal with coal ash, you deal with the air pollution, you deal with all the scrubbers and SCR, selected catalytic reduction units, you have to deal with air pollution. If you deal with all those things, it raises the cost of coal to make it uneconomic. And TVA was blinded, and they weren't willing to confront those things until after the Kingston coal ash spill. They really began to deal with it. And so from basically 2011 until 2024, TVA systematically started to retire their aging coal fleet, unfortunately replace it primarily with methane gas units, but also do some renewables and some other things. What happened on Wednesday of this week is a complete reversal of that, because you can track a very clean line from the Kingston coal ash spill. We asked them to do an integrated resource plan. They did it in 2011. And from 2011 through Wednesday, there was a clear track that TVA recognized that for both environmental and economic reasons and lowering risk overall, they should retire their old coal units. And again, these things are 70 years plus years old. And so they had 11 coal units. They're down to 4. The 2 that were sort of resurrected, at least temporarily, on Wednesday, one is their largest, Cumberland, and then one is their oldest, Kingston. There's 2 others. There's one at Gallatin, right outside of Nashville, and one up in western Kentucky at Shawnee that were slated to retire later. Those were not talked about much at the board meeting. They focused mainly on stopping and reversing these 2. Does this decision make economic sense? Absolutely not. Is there a rationale for needing to do this? Because, as they said, because of digital demand and other things, load growth, that they're needed? We doubt that. But because of the dysfunction that Trump did last year by taking the board into a non-quorum situation, there was an integrated resource plan that was in the works that was never fully ratified by the board because the board was in a non-quorum state. In that draft environmental impact statement, in the environmental impact statement related to the draft, but in the actual integrated resource plan, TVA did not at that time need these plants. And that is why they were able to retire them. It wasn't going to cause a problem with load. We do not know that there's anything substantial that has happened between that last public analysis and now that has changed, other than the Ministry of Truth dictating down to them that they should all of a sudden embrace clean, beautiful coal and prop it up even though it's not needed and it's not economic. There's no empirical evidence that it's needed. And you can think about that. TVA is experiencing load growth, but they have a number of methane gas plants, and they were even doing some solar and some other things that are in the works that were able to cover that projected load growth. And there's nothing that's visible that has changed other than the Ministry of Truth dictate.
And so, what does this mean functionally? Were those plants already in some process of having their output reduced, that they're now going to fire back up? Or does this just mean that they'll keep operating as they are for however long until maybe there's a subsequent change in policy down the road?
That is a very good question. Because the board is not transparent and because the economics to this decision are not transparent, no one knows for sure. Interestingly, the board delegated to the CFO, Rice, the ability to make that decision, which to me indicates that at least internally to TVA, they know that this doesn't make economic sense. And so they want to give their CFO some flexibility in carrying it out. But the theatrics of it to correspond to what was going on in the White House almost simultaneously with the sort of coal revival that Trump was happening in the East Room, these things were orchestrated together. But if you think about it and you look at the performance in the 85, 90 plus years that TVA has been in existence, to their credit, they haven't had rolling blackouts except for once. And that happened during Winter Storm Elliott. And what triggered that in a very profound way was the fact that the Cumberland plant went down in the middle of the winter storm, and it precipitated the things. When we had this most recent bout of weather, Fern, these are like wayward children. We've got all these names for all these winter storms now, but Fern, basically Cumberland dropped down again and was offline. So the reliability of these things is in question. And part of that is not unexpected. If you're going to retire those units, you are not doing the upkeep and maintenance because it costs a ton of money. I mean, these things are not cheap to operate. And so are we now going to see them have to spend money for both the methane plants and now going back and trying to prop up these coal plants because the Ministry of Truth directive that you have to do this, even though it's not grounded in any empirical reality? I mean, I don't know. We don't know that yet. So it's a huge outstanding question. And I don't believe that there's any rational reason that they will keep these plants going from an economic or obviously not an environmental point of view, because these plants Cumberland's one of the biggest polluters in the country, based primarily on its size, but also just the fact that it's, a coal-fired power plant. So, and their heat rates, which is a measure of their efficiency, are all pretty low. They're going to be much lower compared to these new methane gas plants, which they're continuing. They've got the pipeline infrastructure and they're actually in the construction phase at Cumberland. So it makes no sense. But outside of the theatrics and the politics. And so the other key term that I've used to describe the moment we're in with TVA is I have never seen them so politically captured. Capture is a term of art, and they are captured by the administration. Normally, and we saw it with the first Trump administration, TVA pushed back when Trump was telling them to slow things down. They continued to retire their plants. Because that was in that window I was telling you from 2011 till Wednesday. Even in the Biden administration, as much as we wanted TVA to move quicker on some of the renewables and everything, they pushed back even on Biden. They are undeniably fully captured, unapologetically. And when you hear their CFO thanking the Energy Dominance Council and talking about, I've never heard a executive at TVA talk about coal as big, beautiful coal. Mm-hmm. That is the extent of the capture that the moment we're in.
Well, and so speaking of capture, to turn our attention to the national level, although of course climate change is both local and national because it's everywhere all the time. The Trump EPA, obviously, the day right after TVA made this decision with the coal plants, the Trump EPA released their long anticipated reversal of the endangerment finding that I guess dates back to the Obama administration that first established that the federal government had authority and jurisdiction to regulate carbon emissions on the grounds that they posed hazards to human health. That, of course, was challenged, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court that, yes, the federal government does have this authority. So now EPA has come back and just basically said, never mind, right? So, I mean, I know that this was anticipated, but just your reactions to that, and what does that mean for us here? What does it mean for TVA? What does it mean for our power producers?
Well, this is very, very serious. I think the term of art that EPA used was they had rescinded the endangerment finding. I am not well versed in all the granularity of all the legal challenges, because this is going to be challenged legally, and there is good evidence that the scientific rationale that the EPA is using for justifying this rescission are pulling back from their commitment to basically regulate greenhouse gases is not strong in the current administration, which is not surprising because they're largely anti-science and they tend to, dictate stuff as opposed to actually verify it. But let's go back conceptually here for a second and just really realize the moment we're in. There is a very strong scientific consensus that we are pushing our home planet, the only planet we have, or the only home we have, and into areas of instability that we have never experienced before in all of recorded human history. We sort of take for granted that the climate on the planet Earth is stable, and since the Holocene, the last 12,000 years or so, it has been, and that's what has allowed agriculture and human flourishing to happen, and all these things. We are moving the planet into levels of instability that have not been documented on this planet for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. We have got to address this, and the fact that this administration continues to call climate change a hoax, a scam, a con job, and does not bring any empirical science to the table on that is extraordinarily problematic. EPA is let's remember what EPA stands for, Environmental Protection Agency. They are the entity within the federal government that is supposed to protect the environment. What they did in this rescission is basically say, we no longer are going to protect the atmosphere against these pollutants that basically are causing these profound disruptions that we're seeing. Wildfires, flooding, extreme weather events, the droughts. I mean, I could go on and on about how our lived experience is seeing these things manifest, and the science behind it is sort of like gravity. It's very basic of what's going on. They're dismissing all that. They're just flat out claiming it doesn't exist and that therefore they don't have to do it. It's a distortion of reality. And so again, gets back to this sort of dystopian 1984, we shall dictate what reality is, even though it doesn't line up for what our lived experience is. That's the moment we're in. It's profound. I think that where it manifests most directly is that the utilities had started moving already into a zone of reducing their carbon emissions. And because they have this long runway, they have to make multi-billion-dollar decisions for plants that take 5 years or more to build, cost billions of dollars, and then have a tail of 40 plus years or so. I don't know that this is going to cause a lot of change because there's so much risk. And I think most of the folks in the utility industry had come to terms with the fact that carbon is an issue that they have to deal with. Where I think it's going to have the most impact is in the transportation sector with automobiles, because I think that we hadn't fully got the automobile industry to make that shift. We're in the middle of a transition from internal combustion engines to hybrids to full battery electric, which is where we ultimately need to go. And I think this is going to further complexify that. And I think that it's going to be tricky to see kind of how tailpipe standards and other things, which ultimately were leading to more efficient vehicles, which save people money, and ultimately leading to the United States staying competitive in the world market with their automobile manufacturers in the form of going to electric and hybrid cars. Zeldin, the EPA administrator, and Trump seem to be very aggressively trying to say that we don't need to go electric. Somehow or another, we're going to double down on petroleum and fossil fuels, hydrocarbons, whereas the rest of the world is rapidly moving away from it. And so, this American isolationism, I think, is going to have a devastating effect for the U.S. automobile industry, because we're sending them all the wrong signals to make the transition, and we're pretending that this climate reality that we're dealing with is not happening. So I think it's going to have effect on the utilities to some degree, but I think it's going to have much more effect on the automobile industry. TVA is a unique example because TVA is federal, and the board of TVA is appointed by the Trump administration. Therefore, they are particularly receptive to the Ministry of Truth dictates, like we saw. And so that's why I think TVA is such a stark example of this sort of reversal. I think a lot of the other utilities are probably scratching their head a little bit and trying to figure out, what are we going to do? But I think the automobile industry is where this is really going to be problematic.
Mm-hmm. Well, to close out, I wanted to hit on one other thing, which is you all put out a regular report you do on energy efficiency in the Southeast, and kind of looking at the opportunities there and also where we're lagging in a lot of ways. And that might sound like kind of a small ball thing to talk about, energy efficiency in the face of these larger, literally planet changing things we're talking about. But I guess, what are the opportunities there? And, one point that you've made a few times here is that a lot of these decisions, and especially decisions around efficiency, are really driven by economics. They're not driven just by, tree hugging, like we want to make the planet nice for everybody. It's that actually efficiency saves money for people. So what is the status of energy efficiency in the Southeast? And is there any low-hanging fruit there that could actually make some difference for people or organizations?
No, you're absolutely right. And I think we're going to see, going into this next election cycle and probably even into 2028, that energy affordability is going to be a dominant issue. We saw it in the Virginia election. We saw it in the New Jersey election. We've seen it percolating down in Georgia with the Public Service Commission races, that two progressives finally got on the commission, statewide office positions in Georgia. The bad decision making that is happening by the Trump administration, kneecapping solar, kneecapping wind, which are the least cost, rapidly deployed things, getting too heavily dependent on methane gas, and now trying to resurrect coal, which is inefficient, playing with nuclear power in the sense that, there's a lot of speculative plays going on there, but nuclear power, you saw it with Plant Vogtle, $35 billion, the most expensive power plant ever built in the history of the United States down in Georgia. There are a lot of things that are happening that are putting upward pressure on utility rates, which ultimately raise people's bills. Other mundane things like just poles and wires and updating and modernization is also contributing to that. So I am very confident in saying that your prices are going to go up. We've already seen it. TVA's raised their rates, base rates, close to 10% over the last few years. And we're seeing prices go up across the Southeast. The quickest way to deal with that is, remember, you don't pay a rate as a consumer, you pay a bill. And the bill is rate, whatever they charge per unit, times your consumption. And where energy efficiency matters is you can actually control your consumption. So if you have an energy efficient appliance that uses 25% or 30% less energy, even if your rates go up a little bit, but your overall consumption goes down, what you pay can go down or be held steady. So that's where this is so important, is people get transfixed on what the rate is, but really what they have the most control over is their consumption. And that's where energy efficiency really pays the dividends. And so we saw during the Biden administration, with the push towards the Inflation Reduction Act, there were lots of incentives and there was lots of motivation for people to get discounts and rebates and direct grants and other things like that to increase their efficiency. And a number of people were taking advantage of that. In the big BS bill that they passed, they kneecapped a lot of that stuff and took it out. So that meant that you're not going to get the same price support incentives and stuff to basically do efficiency. But the efficiency still makes economic sense, particularly now that your bills are going, your rates are going up. And so what we saw in our report across the Southeast is that normally what we see across the country is that every year utilities use efficiency to reduce about 0.5% of their overall projected load growth. We want to see that number above 1%, and there are some places in the country that are 1% or more. In the Southeast, we are even below the national average of reducing by about 0.5%. We're down in the 0.3%. And for some utilities, it's even much, much lower. So we benchmarked all the utilities across the Southeast, and it's on our website. We had a webinar earlier this week about it, where you can compare and contrast your utility about what their programs are, and you can see whether you're being availed an opportunity by the utility to take advantage. Now, you can always go and buy an more energy efficient appliance or whatever. The utility doesn't dictate that. But if the utility is not providing you programs, not connecting things together so that you're becoming a better consumer, what ends up happening is that drives up their demand because you're using more energy than you have to. It forces them to buy more fuel, which ends up polluting the air more or whatever. And so this is such a well-connected way to deal with the energy affordability crisis. So the bottom line is Southeast is way below the national average. A number of our utilities are very poor performers. The ones that were doing well are over in North Carolina and South Carolina. That's Duke Energy. That's because their commission has actually provided a financial incentive for the utility to actually hit these targets. We had promises that Georgia Power was going to do it, but they backed away from it, and the commission let them back away from it. TVA, to their credit, over the last few years, started ticking back up and getting back in the energy efficiency of business a little bit. It is completely unclear now whether this new board is going to keep those programs going or not. I fear that they may not. So we're in a period where we have rising prices and we don't have the utility partnerships that we need in order to maximize efficiency. But customers can still do lots of things in their home to protect themselves. If they remember that basic equation, rate times consumption equals your bill, you can anticipate your rates are going up. So now you've got to figure out how you moderate your consumption.
All right. And people can find that report. Your website is SACE.org, right? SACE.
Well, it's cleanenergy.org.
My bad. Cleanenergy.org.
Yeah. And so it's up there. And so we encourage you to take a look at it, and you can see where your utility is. And then we also have some other related information about efficiency. Remember, the electron you don't use is the greenest and least cost of all the electrons out there. So, there's a lot of intelligence in focusing on efficiency first before you do anything else, in your home, because it's like a dividend that keeps paying you back.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining us, Steve. Always good to talk. And I know it's been quite a week, so I appreciate your time.
Quite a week. Well, and look, I really appreciate y'all staying on top of these issues and making sure, they're aware, because there's so much distraction out there. You've got to separate the signal from the noise about what's really happening. And so, I'm glad that you guys are focused on the signal and not just the noise.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for helping us.
Yep. All right. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks a lot.
And thanks again to Steve for his thoughts and insights. And again, you can find more information at cleanenergy.org. One thing Seth just pointed out to me that we should acknowledge here is that this is the 200th episode of Compass Points. That's pretty impressive.
It is that's almost 4 years. We've only skipped a few weeks here and there for holidays or something majorly important. So if a year's still 52 weeks like I thought it was, then we were just short of 4 years of taping. I just didn't cross my mind. It's been going so much fun, so fast.
Well, if you are one of our loyal listeners and you think you have logged all 200 episodes, if you've listened to every one of them, send us a note at info@compassknox.com and we'll recognize you somehow. I don't know what. We don't have any T-shirts or anything, but we can come up with some way. I feel like people who have been with us from the start and are hanging in there every week because they want to know what's going on in Knoxville and Knox County.
Right, but if you're
give
elected,
us a shout.
If you're an elected official or a government employee of the state or of the county or the city, you don't count.
We're not going to bribe you.
We're not going to reward you. That might get exactly. That's what I was trying to just. Yeah, we appreciate you, and I love.
We need some way to recognize people. The loyal listeners club or something.
I will say for almost 4 years of doing this stuff, I personally really appreciate when I go and bother somebody about something. They're like, "Oh yeah, the weather's great." I quite often get some mention of my bad weather reports, and I appreciate. I'm a huge fan of any icebreaker I can have when I'm talking to people, and getting made fun of for my weather reports is certainly one of them. So
sure, well, it's we're building your clout.
Yeah, yes. Well, cloud. We'll say that or something.
All right. Looking ahead to this coming week, there are a couple of meetings. County Commission will hold its monthly agenda review meeting and its monthly zoning meeting. But please note, these will be on Tuesday, February 17th, because Monday is President's Day, and so they are not meeting on that day.
Which also means the banks are closed and your kids aren't at school.
That's right. Are schools closed for President's Day? I always forget that, honestly.
Not, once I said it out loud, I started doubting myself, but I'm pretty sure it's on my calendar. Let's see what
It can be hard to...
System-wide in-service day, yeah.
There we go. All right. So it's an in-service day. Yeah. So
Teachers
sorry,
kids aren't.
Teachers, you have to report to work, but the kids are off on Monday. So Commission will have its agenda review meeting at 3 p.m., the zoning meeting at 5 p.m. on that day. Neither of those look... terribly exciting. The agenda review, they'll be talking about the agenda for their monthly voting meeting, which will be the next Monday on the 23rd. The only items there that kind of stand out, one is an ordinance that relates to what we were just talking about with the Juvenile Service Center, because County Commission had actually passed an ordinance last year that was going to move supervision and administration of the Juvenile Service Center to the Sheriff's Office. They have backed off of that. The Sheriff's Office wasn't super interested in taking that on, and it is now proposed to actually be placed under Juvenile Court Judge Tim Irwin. So that change to that ordinance is on the agenda this month. Probably that will get a lot of support since it's coming from a board that's made up of 5 county commissioners to start with, but I'm sure there will be further discussion of it. And then also, Commissioner Andy Fox still has an item on the agenda that was deferred from last month that would encourage the Sheriff's Office to engage more actively in immigration enforcement. The Sheriff's Office already has a 287G agreement that allows sheriff's employees at the jail to conduct immigration reviews of everybody who comes into the jail, and if somebody does not have legal status in the country, the sheriff's employees can actually initiate deportation proceedings and then transfer them to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Fox is proposing that the sheriff's office actually enter into an enforcement agreement, which would allow sheriff's deputies to be trained in immigration enforcement, and then they could actually be out making immigration stops and detaining people. Like right now, the only people who get processed through the jail agreement are people who are arrested on some other criminal offense and are brought to the jail, this would having an enforcement agreement would actually allow them to stop people and detain them just for immigration violations, which the sheriff's office does not do right now.
So on a functional question on how our division of government works here locally, this would be a request for the sheriff to take that on. The sheriff is not obliged to.
Right. County Commission doesn't run County Commission, it's much like the school system where County Commission approves the funding for the sheriff's office, but it doesn't have jurisdiction over the sheriff's office. They could not force the sheriff to do this. So this would at most be a resolution from Commission encouraging the sheriff's office to do this. Fox has very strong views about illegal immigration and basically wants everybody gone, and so I think he sees this as a way to, bolster already existing enforcement that ICE is doing.
Right, but in all of this, we also have one of the, what did they call? What's the batch of bills that they made a fun name for the batch of bills that the state's doing?
Immigration Agenda 2026. Yeah,
which
at the state legislature.
Which one of those may include forcing the sheriff's office to do it?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd have to go back and look at those bills. I don't know if those bills require an enforcement agreement. They might be looking at they certainly are looking at requiring active cooperation between local law enforcement and ICE. I don't know to what degree any of those bills would actually require this step. The reason that Fox deferred this item last month, at least from what we heard, was that he got pushback from the sheriff's office over it because these 287G agreements do not come with funding. Now, there is a pot of state money that can be used to help support immigration efforts at local levels.
Sure, and I suppose at some level, if you have the commission requesting you take on an activity, then when you ask for money on the budget season coming up, it should feel a little better about getting that budget cut.
Maybe county commission. But then that becomes a challenge for commission because, as we know, the Knox County budget is actually stretched extremely thin already, and so how much they want to invest in something like this, who knows? I don't even know for sure that it was deferred last month. I don't know for sure that it's going to come up for action this month. So that may well depend on what Fox and other commissioners are hearing from the sheriff's office about it.
And I guess my point is that this will be a preview of some budget conversation coming up, both at the state level and on our local budget conversations.
Yeah,
this is going to have to include budget stuff, and so how the other commissioners as well as the public react to Andy Fox's current conversation may kind of give you some hints at what we'll see coming up, because it's certainly going to be part of the sheriff's election process. Certainly be a conversation on these sheriffs as they're running to replace Mr. Spangler.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then City Council is also meeting on Tuesday the 17th, which is their normal meeting day, and they'll have their beer board meeting at 5 o'clock and then their regular council meeting at 6 o'clock. The council, if the commission agenda looks pretty light, the City Council agenda is almost non-existent. It's very, very short. Has a couple of contracts for road paving and sidewalk construction. There is just not a lot on it, so it will probably be a short meeting unless something unexpected happens or some particular item becomes controversial in unexpected ways. But I think there's a good chance that that's going to be a real quickie.
Well, and I think all the city councilors are pretty busy looking into the budget season coming up.
Right. So exactly, they'll have just come out of this budget retreat and kind of be thinking about that whole process. And who knows? Maybe that'll inform some of the discussion at Tuesday's meeting, because again, we have 5 new city council members, so they're having their first budget retreat right now, and probably getting a whole bunch of information and perspectives that they'll still be processing. That may lead them to ask questions about some of the things that are on this agenda. So I guess we will see, and certainly we will be back here next week, hopefully including Scott, because I don't think there's any public meetings scheduled for next Friday, to talk about whatever happens at those meetings and anything else that happens during the week. But that'll wrap us up here for this week. Thanks again to Steve Smith for joining us. Thanks to Lord Seth for his production work here at Barbarian Productions. Our music is by Will Wright, and we'll talk to you later.
CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.